up in the 80s, and everybody else. I've put it all together, and these are people who, overall, there's up to 100 different points of correlation between these different stories, and I withhold a lot from the internet because there are unscrupulous individuals out there who will take this and say that they're insiders and then want to go out there and bilk people out of their money. What do we find out? We find out that because of the unique nurturing energy that's in our solar system, this is used as a sort of a rehab colony for negative groups. They were banished here by ETs from other worlds, other solar systems out there, that said, you guys are too warlike, get the heck out of here, we're sending you over there to rehabilitate. We're going to put you on a nice desert island. So we're Australia. We're Botany Bay, okay? Our solar system was a prison colony. Now, they didn't, the good beings that did this didn't think of it that way, but the people who got sent here had a lot of enemies, and they pissed a lot of people off. Now, these original people had spent many, many, many millennia in space. And the longer you stay in space as a human being, because one of the things we learn is that everybody that is an extraterrestrial is some kind of hominid. They got a head, they got arms and legs. They could look a lot different than us. Every type of life that we see on Earth, whether it's birds, whether it's fish, whether it's reptiles, insects, every type of life on Earth has beings that look human or human-like that are derived from that type of life. So you have avian humans, you have simian humans that actually look more like monkeys than we do. You have some that have faces like felines, some that have faces like birds. They actually look like a bird head on a human body. Some of them look like reptilian heads on human bodies. Some of them have insect heads on human bodies. All these different types are out there. And it seems that different types that look more alike tend to stick together more. And that includes the reptilians, which happen to be the bad guys in the story. It sounds cliche, it just happens to be true. So these people have been floating around in the cosmos for a really long time, and they got very highly evolved to such an extent that they communicate by micro-voltage changes in the glow on their face that's like broadband internet. So they can communicate much faster than speaking, and that's why for people like us to try to talk to these guys, it's almost impossible. They can't even imagine trying to speak in regular speech, like at the speed that we do. It would be way too slow. Now, these folks are called, in the insider world, the world of the Illuminati, they call them the progenitors. Now, imagine that our space program, we start building ships that can travel out of the solar system. You know that they exist. You know that they got the Roswell crash, right? You know they reverse engineered it. You know about Area 51. Don't you think they'd fly into space? Don't you think they'd want to see some stuff out there once they got out there? Guess what they found? They found all kinds of build-outs inside moons and inside asteroids predominantly, where the entire room is built for people that are that large. Now, imagine walking into a room where the countertops alone are like 40 feet high. All the original equipment has been removed, probably because of scavengers, bone pickers. So a lot of what we find out there is big, giant, empty rooms that are massive in size with very massive doors that are like 100 feet tall. There's still, in some cases, machines that still work inside these facilities built by these very large extraterrestrials they call the progenitors. As I've been saying, the majority, according to the insiders I've spoken to, the majority of all the moons in our solar system have some degree of ancient bases inside them for people that are very, very tall. And in many cases, those bases have then been reoccupied later on. Because beings like these progenitors will come through and they'll build things out, they'll live here for a while, and then they mothball it and they go somewhere else. And then maybe for them, what might be just a few years, for us could be millions of years, they eventually come back and they reoccupy the facility again. So these facilities are ready to go. So in a lot of cases, we just fly in and we start building out what's already been built there, and it saves us an awful lot of time. So let's start from how our progenitors, as they're called, came in. They came in, and Neptune has a moon system, which I'm showing you now. And this is just to give you the sense of some of the stuff that's out there. All these different moons, or at least most of them from what I've been told from different people, and I got to combine it all together, most of these moons have settlements on them. Gigantic rooms inside. I've been told by one of the insiders, one of the original insiders, was that some of these moons, the entire inside has an atmosphere. And there is something like a geometric object, like those platonic solids, and you actually see trees and lakes, and there's an artificial sun, and you can fly around inside that moon, and you can pilot the moon anywhere you want to go, and it's like a whole world built inside of it. That's an advanced, obviously very advanced technology that apparently is all over the place. You could have a whole world of people living inside this object, hiding from their enemies. Because these people, remember, were a prison colony. They were in trouble, and they were sent here to reform, and they also had enemies, and they were really worried about being attacked. And the idea here is that at some point, this group, which probably had a population of hundreds of billions of people at the apex of their civilization, their enemies came back, and they got wiped out. And of course, this brings us to the infamous monuments of Mars, which appear to be some of the survivors of what we're going to see became the asteroid belt. And after that, which was originally a planet, that's one of the things everybody on the inside tells you, is there was a super Earth in our solar system. Now, some people call it Electra, some people call it Tiamat. That's the two different names for it I've heard from the space program. After this planet exploded, and we'll get to that in a minute, the survivors apparently settled on Mars. And Mars had been largely damaged because Mars was an Earth-like moon orbiting this super-Earth, but it still had enough ocean and atmosphere left that it could be lived on, predominantly through underground bases, and they were able to rebuild it for a while and built up a civilization. Now, this is the original picture that shows what appears to be a face, and this has been widely attacked, but as you can see here, it clearly is casting a shadow. It looks very much like a face with a headdress on it. And then, as this is one of Hoagland's, he just basically cropped around the original NASA photograph, you see the face over there on the right, which very much looks like a face, and then on the left, we have this whole crazy-looking city of things that look very much like pyramids. Now let's take a closer look at that. That, to me, is very much not a natural formation. So this is the result of people building pyramids, and then, as I showed you in the previous slide, the face is right over there, right where the sun sets. So they could watch the sunset over this monument, which is probably a monument to one of their leaders. So in 1998, Mark Carlotto did a geometric projection from the side where you can actually see really clearly the huge structure of that face, which, again, is very obviously an intelligently built structure, and then you got this city of pyramids, and then notice what you got over there on the bottom right. There is another pyramid down there that's actually five-sided. You can see it here in this picture, not very well, but it's right down there in the middle. So let's take a look at that one now. That's what it looks like from the top view, and that's what it looks like from the side. Again, this object, they estimate, is 1.5 miles wide. It's enormous, and it's big enough that it could potentially hold 1 billion people inside. It's a very, very large facility that probably originally was quite a beautiful glass-like structure. The space program people have traveled to the face on Mars, to the pyramids on Mars, and from what they've told me, these structures are there, but they are under a great deal of sediment. There was a massive catastrophe that hit Mars that wiped them out, and that is described in the Law of One as having happened approximately 200,000 of our years ago. And the planet that exploded, they said, was more like 800,000 years ago. So it's interesting to note that the shape of this five-sided pyramid has the human proportion built into it, suggesting it was built by humans who look like us. Because there's the Vitruvian Man that just drops right in perfectly into the shape of that pyramid. Isn't that interesting? There's all kinds of very strange and wonderful mathematical relationships between this five-sided pyramid and the surrounding geometry on the plateau. I'm not going to bore you with all that, and we don't have enough time. That's Richard Hoagland's thing. I highly recommend reading his book, The Monuments of Mars, because that is the best source for all of that information. Then NASA comes out in 1998 and tries to debunk this whole thing by releasing what Art Bell called the cat box, in which they washed out the blacks and whites, they washed out the contrast, and sent us this image on the left to say, oh, all these people that think it's a face, they don't know what they're looking at. That was disinformation, folks. That thing on the left doesn't look anything like what I showed you and the very beautiful shadows that it cast on the original NASA slides. Why? Because they don't want us to know that they already have a base on Mars. They've had it since the Nazis originally settled on Mars, believe it or not, as early as the late 1930s, early 1940s. The Nazis had already landed on Mars. They had some huge problems. They tried originally to settle around the equator, but there's these electrical storms that EMP'd all their systems, fried their systems. So now apparently the bases they build are around the North Pole, the pole, top and bottom pole, but especially the North Pole. And they have a facility there on Mars that has 200,000 personnel. And only 10,000 of those people are actually born on Earth. And it's apparently expanding very rapidly from what I've been hearing. So one of our earlier space program insiders, Henry Deacon, talked about this Mars city that they've got up there, which is one of the basic places that people end up going if you go into the space program. So this civilization, this renegade group we call the progenitors, according to the military insider, Richard Hoagland's top insider, this military group, the progenitor people were on the run. They were criminals. And they were sent to our solar system. This was their place of refuge and escape. And they colonized our fourth planet, which is Electra or Tiamat. And this planet was where they grew to ultimately at least 100 billion people and probably a lot more than that. They were all in the 70 to 100 foot tall range. They're very large. And a larger planet supports a larger body, so this all makes sense. So Mars would have been a much smaller moon compared to the size of this planet. Now, again, it was originally a moon, and then after the planet, it probably had some settlement. Well, the big planet was settled, and then after the big planet totally exploded, some of the settlers on Mars survived. So that might be the size of Mars compared to the original super Earth. It was very large. So Tiamat or Electra exploded, and here's the thing. Our Earth's moon was the crown jewel of their entire collection. The moon was actually an ancient build-out. I have been told by almost everybody who's a space program insider across the board, the entire interior of our moon, all the way around, 360 degrees in every direction, 20 to 50 miles deep, and it's all hollow, and it's all loaded with rooms for these 70-foot tall progenitor people inside. The whole interior of the moon. That trips me out. So there was a last-minute effort to flee inside the moon. Apparently billions of them managed to get in at the last minute, but the moon, even so, was heavily damaged as they fled. They could drive the moon away from the damage, but the problem is there were chunks of their original planet, which we now call asteroids, flying around everywhere, and they were getting hit. Boom, 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 boom. So they took a lot of damage, and a lot of that ancient base inside was destroyed. The moon was heavily damaged on the inside. There were bodies everywhere. It was horrible. They lost a lot of their technology. This is one of the things we've heard, is that after the moon went out there, they resettled on Mars, and they got shorter. Their height starts to drop. So this appears to be when they go down to about the 36-foot range and lower. So they lose their height, and they've got bodies all over the place inside, and it stinks. It's horrible. There's flies. It's just disgusting. So they have to resettle on the surface of the moon by building domes out of that same glass or something similar that they could still do, and they rebuilt their civilization in glass domes on the surface. At this point, they had trees and plants and all kinds of cool things under the glass on the moon. So the moon was like a really nice place to live. And they start traveling to the Earth as giant humans compared to what was native on Earth, which was probably just like caveman. And they began creating huge cities. And as the tides on the Earth kind of jump-started everything, and as the conditions got better, they eventually built an enormous civilization on Earth in what we now think of as Northern Africa. And that is the area that you see here as the Sahara Desert and Saudi Arabia, the whole Persian Gulf, and then on up even into the Carpathian Mountains up there. Now, there's kind of a problem here, isn't there? What does it look like right now? It's like a big old wasteland of nothing. Well, it turns out that these people still could not get over their warlike ways. They still wanted to kick ass. They still wanted to kill people. And eventually their enemies came and wiped them out again. And one of the most fascinating things the insiders told me is, forget about even leaving the earth. If you're a treasure hunter and you want to find good stuff, all you got to do is have the advanced satellite technology they already possess and start digging down in the desert, the Sahara. You could go as little as 40 feet down, sometimes up to 200-300 feet of sand down, and there is an extraordinary amount of technologically advanced artifacts down there. They're everywhere. The Egyptians then ended up eventually living on what was the surviving highlands, the only part that was left after this war, which was actually where the Great Pyramid is, where the Sphinx is, right up there, at the top of the Persian Gulf, right up there between Saudi Arabia and Africa. That little tiny part was the highest area, and that's where civilization clung to. Now, these people obviously got blown up. This is what I was told. And apparently they still survived. Some of their descendants still survived, and they've been keeping themselves a secret. So a lot of this stuff about the moon is stuff they don't want us to know because they're still afraid that they're going to be isolated and attacked. They still think we're going to treat them as villains and criminals and want to kill them. Nobody's screaming, nobody's running out of the room, but it was decided that you couldn't handle the truth. So then what we have is this Brookings Institution report that said that mankind might topple if we were faced by a race of superior beings. So they felt that we couldn't be told because our civilization and our way of life would collapse. Enemies of these people who were still making war came back again. They blasted the moon. They hit it actually with a projectile that was the size of an 18-wheeler truck going 3/4 the speed of light. And it hit that moon and it just damaged it like crazy, shattered all the glass, and apparently we think that the civilization around the Sahara Desert was wiped out dramatically at the same time. And because this impact was so strong, they're shattered, they're damaged, and a lot of the damage has been left behind as sort of like a museum memorial. And so every now and then some of this stuff shows up. The entire northern third of Africa was completely wiped out in the blast, leaving behind what we now call the Sahara Desert. You dig down 40 to 300 feet, and there's all kinds of toys there. Now notice, this is the only part of the earth that looks like that. Do you see that? It's this big, huge desert. Like everything else has been undisturbed, and probably if you waited another 500,000 years or something, it's going to come back. But this is only about, we estimate, based on multiple insiders I've talked to and trying to thread it with what was said in the Edgar Cayce readings and what was said in the Law of One, it appears that this happened 50,000 years ago. That this was the first big Atlantis on Earth that was wiped out 50,000 years ago, which both books, both the Edgar Cayce readings and the Law of One, point to a major, major war around that time that took place. As I said, the highlands of the original civilization was Egypt, and so they then built out stuff over what was originally there. So the Sphinx appears to be a recarving of an older monument, and the Great Pyramid is built on a big, big ridge of rock underneath. So as I said before, there's tons of technological artifacts under there. 30 to 400. I have to change that data based on new information. And the Egyptian priesthood went around and found some of these old books from people who were out there in our solar system. So what we find out is that the Library of Alexandria in Egypt was the storehouse for all these archaeological expeditions they were doing, finding these books that were made out of pages of almost unbreakable material, like made out of something like Kevlar. And that the books were then stored in the Library of Alexandria which once it was invaded by the Romans, they did a false flag, and they burned only things like census documents and tax forms and kept all the good stuff and brought it to, guess where? The Vatican Library. So one of my oldest insiders, Dr. Pete Peterson, was invited to go to the Vatican Library and allowed to read some of these old books, and he said that some of them had like barcodes on them, and all it was digital-looking code on every page. Some of them had very elaborate images of spaceships and space stations and bases inside moons and all this stuff. And the Egyptian priests had been able to translate some of this stuff, and so there were also books of translations in ancient Egyptian language and Greek and Roman, things like this, of what the actual original books said. So the books tend to have a solid color on them, like you'll have a blue cover or a red cover that's all leather. The books tend to have a buckle on them, so you actually can buckle it like your pants to keep it closed. And again, most of the pages are kind of like an off-white color, and they're made of some kind of indestructible material. There's also a whole series of books that are made out of metallic plates that have engravings on them. So this is something that's being kept in the Vatican Library. They don't want us to know because it has the history of these people. Now, if you hear about the Illuminati, if you watch the movie Eyes Wide Shut, you hear about something called the Saturn cult and the Festival of Saturnalia. Why? Because these people trace themselves back to the progenitors who had originally settled on Saturn. So if you look in Eyes Wide Shut, when they're all wearing the masks, they do this dance where they go around in a circle, and that emulates the rings of Saturn orbiting. Because they trace themselves as the descendants of Saturn, and they believe that they're different from the rest of us, that they have extraterrestrial DNA that made them the gods. So there were a very small number of survivors when the moon was blown up, and they got out with only, apparently the story is, the moon was so badly hit that only a few of their damaged spacecraft got out, and their civilization on Earth was almost completely wiped out, so just a small number of them made it, and they crash-landed on Earth. And they then interbred with humans, which they were specifically warned not to do, and this created what we call in the book of Enoch, the fallen angels. Their offspring, their children most likely, the hybrids of their own form, which was about 36 feet tall, and native people on Earth, became these 12 to 13 foot tall, red-headed, white-skinned humans. And white skin was not normal for the Earth. And this is preserved in a book that the Vatican did not want you to read, that wasn't even found until the 1800s, but it's very old. It's as old as the book of Genesis, called the Book of Enoch. It's a very, very important text. And I'm going to be doing a lot more about this as I go on, probably writing it into my books. The Scottish explorer James Bruce discovered several copies of it in Ethiopia in 1773. It was translated in 1821, and Jesus quotes from this book in the New Testament, so he obviously thought it was pretty important. The key chapters are chapters 1 through 36, called the Book of the Watchers, and it says that this man, Enoch, was Noah's grandfather, and that he lived for 365 years, so he was some kind of extraterrestrial. Enoch acts as a messenger for what appear to be benevolent extraterrestrials who had threatened these people on Earth, the Watchers, with total destruction that became Noah's flood. But before the flood, before their civilization was wiped out again, because we're now talking about 12,000 years ago, the big Atlantean flood, they used Enoch as a messenger to kind of cut a deal with the good guys, the benevolent ETs, and say, would you please not destroy us? In this book, the Book of Enoch, it says that there was only 200 of them that descended. They became the fallen angels. Lucifer was one of the fallen angels, interestingly enough. He was the leader. The insiders I've spoken to have said it's probably a lot more than 200, that they had interbred here for some time. They had huge population numbers again, and this event, Noah's flood, completely wiped them out. It says in 7:5-6 that they were cannibals. They began eating us, and they begged God for forgiveness in 13:4, and they were turned down, obviously. And then a great flood was created to cleanse the earth of these so-called Watchers, which they're still pissed off about and still punishing us for all these years later. Because we, i.e. non-extraterrestrial humans, were God's chosen, and they were the fallen angels, the cast outs. So now they feel like they need to get revenge on us, and that we are the wicked and they are the just. And what does the Bible say? That the money will be taken from the wicked and given to the just. Well, that's how they justify the economic redistribution that they've done with things like the Federal Reserve, the IMF, the World Bank, and the Bank for International Settlements. But some of these people never died out completely. In fact, they've been around up until very recently in some cases. Let's look at the example of Easter Island. Jacob Roggeveen and C.F. Behrens, two Dutch explorers, visited there on Easter Island, first people from the West to get there, 1722. And when they got there, they saw 12-foot-tall white men with red hair that had long earlobes, just like you see in the sculptures. And then they were peacefully coexisting with the natives that were called Hanau Monoko. So you have these two different groups, Hanau Epe and Hanau Momoko. And the natives had shorter ears, darker skin, and a typical human height. So these giants actually spoke to the explorers. Apparently something happened afterwards where they were removed. And this brings us to a very interesting and highly controversial thing. It's probably going to get me in a lot of trouble, which is the subject of stasis beings. What the heck are stasis beings? Apparently some of the oldest people who got to the earth, and this may be the progenitors, we don't really know. They had a very advanced crystal technology, and they left these crystal artifacts all around the interior of the earth, deep, deep underground, in underground bases and things like that, in some cases natural caverns. You have these crystals that in some cases will glow with a blue light, and they can actually effectively create a time bubble where time basically stops inside the bubble. So you can then get inside this bubble when you activate the crystal properly, and there's obviously some kind of like a timer so you can get set up properly and then wait for the time bubble to kick on, and then the time bubble essentially keeps you so that you only experience like a few weeks, but it could be thousands of years on Earth. Now, there are apparently at least a dozen different stasis being areas around the Earth, as well as others where the crystals collapsed and didn't work. One of these stasis being chambers was found in Ohio, and I have now called it the Illuminati Disneyland. The reason why I say this is that you go into this, there's a river in Ohio apparently, there's a mouth down at the bottom, a big cave opening, you go in there, you walk in a long way, and then eventually what you see is a room that's about 60 to 100 feet tall, it's a dome, it's got black tar painted around the inside, and in the middle are three sarcophagi that are in kind of a Y shape around this thing in the middle that's a big crystal hanging on these supports with four poles, four pillars. The crystal is glowing, and there's some kind of time bubble that you can't get through. It has like a gravitational field. So they had to climb up the side and build like a scaffolding so they could look down and see what was inside these sarcophagi. And what did they see? They saw apparently perfectly preserved giant humans who were around 12 feet tall, three of them, all males with red hair, long beards, and, of course, still in stasis and still sleeping. Yes, and here's the crazy part. All these Illuminati guys were going to see it, and they were writing their names on the side of the cave to kind of like tag it, like graffiti. And the name that a lot of people at the higher levels hear, the most notable name on that wall, guess who it was? Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln saw the stasis beings at Illuminati Disneyland. Now imagine the power of being in this group where you are told that you are the descendants of these gods, and you can go to a site like this that has a clearly advanced technology. For people in the 1700s or the 1800s, they didn't have anything like a glowing light. They didn't even have electric light. They just had fire. You have this glowing crystal suspended with these weird like wires or something hanging off of these four posts in the middle, and these people in sarcophagi that are giants with red hair, and they're still sleeping, and they look like they could come back to life. So this is where the Illuminati legend came into play, that, hey, these are our ancestors. These are our own family members. And the curious part is that different stasis chambers have been found all over the Earth, and in the different areas we find different types of humanoid extraterrestrials. They're not all the same. So it seems like multiple different groups found these time crystals and built stasis chambers, and the belief also is that the crystals are programmed to end their stasis as this energetic activation takes place in our solar system. So the Illuminati belief also is that as we get to the end of the cycle, these beings will reawaken, and that is the return of their gods. Okay, so you saw there was a lot of Sumerian-looking stuff. Well, the Sumerians appeared to be quite giant, and this is where the Anunnaki story comes from. Here you have Inanna, and notice that she's got her foot on a lion, and the lion is a 9-foot cat. So you're looking at a 12 to 13-foot tall human here. No, she doesn't look reptilian. She has a human face, but that lion is dwarfed by her. Then you have this guy on the throne, and the guys on the left are dwarfed by him. Again, suggesting that the original people who were here, who were apparently cannibals in the Book of the Watchers, were giants. Now, a lot of times on the old Egyptian walls, you see depictions of different types of humanoids, including humanoids with bird heads. These beings apparently are real, and they're called the avians. There are certain types of ETs that do have bird heads. They don't really look like that. This appears to be an oral legend, not based on eyewitness sightings, but there are actually people that have those bird heads out there. Notice, of course, here that in this temple, look at the height of the doorway. You see the people walking in? You see how much that dwarfs them? That would be perfect for these Anunnaki gods to show up. Now, the original Egyptian god Osiris apparently was very tall, had green skin, had an elongated skull that you see on that hat, and next to the Sphinx he built this stone structure, the Osirian, which is made out of huge blocks, some of which are 100 tons. Notice that he is pictured with some of these people that have like the bird heads. There's an avian there on the right. You got a guy that looks like a native there who has brown skin. Then you have a woman on the left who looks really a lot shorter than Osiris. She's only about half his height compared to him sitting on that throne. And notice again he has the elongated skull. So that's one of the original pharaohs, and over time as they stay on Earth, the Earth's energy fields get to them and they lose their height. That's one of the first things that apparently happens. But for the most part, they retain the elongated skull. So Akhenaten, 15th dynasty now, so 15 generations after Osiris, they've gotten a lot shorter. He lost the green skin, but he's still got the incredible skull. This is a sculpture of Akhenaten. And notice that his hat actually looks like the edge of a UFO, suggesting that he came in a craft that was aerodynamic like that. Very interesting headdress. This is his wife, Nefertiti, drawn with an elongated skull. Another shot, apparently, of Nefertiti or one of their kids, maybe Ramses. Here's another shot of Nefertiti with the elongated skull. You'll see this happens over and over again. And then what do? They call this an artistic style. This is their daughter, Meritaten. Now, do you really think that if a guy was commissioned to do a royal sculpture and he screwed up the way your head looks this much, and he cuts off all your hair, and he doubles the length of your cranium to create this weird, superhuman-looking monstrosity, if that wasn't the way they really looked, do you think he would have gotten out of that room alive? No, you're seeing it, and the Illuminati laugh at you. Because this is right out there at the German museum, the Berlin National Museum, and people say, oh, it was just an artistic style. No, this is the big secret of the Illuminati. This is their daughter thinking that it would look sexy to stick a piece of hair on one side of her bald head. I don't know. I think she ought to work on that look a little bit. I'm not really feeling it. Just call me crazy. Notice also this is Nefertiti's body, that she has apparently a longer spine than we do, and more weight around the midsection. They all seem to have this funny little pot belly and a very narrow rib cage. It's different physiology. They're not quite the same. There's another shot of them with this really narrow rib and then the funny pot belly. Now here we see, on the right, people with elongated skulls, and on the left, people bowing to them in supplication who have normal skulls. And notice that all the people with elongated skulls have winged discs that they're wearing on their heads, suggesting that they got here originally long ago in flying discs, and they are the descendants of the gods. the Illuminati traced themselves as the descendants of these people. So these people were wearing masks in some cases. They came here, and they were the giants, and they wanted human sacrifice. So look at this big guy on the throne, and there has been a war going on to stop this kind of bullshit from happening. And these people have now had their ass kicked. These giants are not on Earth anymore. We've gotten rid of them. But the war still isn't over. It's still ongoing. And apparently these giants, these Anunnaki, are still working through our governments and still trying to win this war that they now know they cannot win because it's too late for them. Once this solar system change happens, it's all over. So there's been a lot of ETs that have showed up all over the planet. The Australians have the Wandjina. Oh, they got stuck with the bad end of the stick on that one, didn't they? We don't like those types. Let's get those out of here. Now, remember, the Illuminati have said that they are the descendants of the giants. Turns out this bloodline, the Diest bloodline, is the central root that connects to all the different European Illuminati families. And they come out of Rome. So this is very unusual, but this was probably one of the last times these people came out in the open. So, up until the 1700s, these giants were still walking around in America. And if you do some digging, the New York Times has some articles that show us these giant skeletons. November 21st, 1856, from the New York Times, we see the description of a skeleton that was found 10 feet 9 inches in length. December 25th, 1868, there was an expedition found in Minnesota by the Sank Rapids Water Power Company, and they were quarrying rock, and they found a 10-foot, 9.5-inch tall skeleton, and the bones alone weighed 364 and a quarter pounds. And they say the body must have weighed at least 900 pounds, so this was a giant. New York Times, September 8th, 1871. Here it is right here. You can look this up. They're still available on the New York Times website. Said that they found giant skulls where the bone itself was nearly an inch thick. Pretty crazy. And the body was 8 or 9 feet tall. There's nobody like that here now, not even basketball players. New York Times, February 8th, 1876. As you can see right here. 3 skeletons were found nearly 9 feet in height in this one dig. Then we have August 10th, 1880. And in this one, we see that there were skeletons that were 11 feet 3 inches long when they were found. May 25th, 1882. This was a mound that was 60 feet in diameter and 12 feet high, in which they found giant skeletons inside. November 20th, and you're going to see this mound thing over and over again. There's lots of mounds that have been built in America. They've all been suppressed. We can hear a little bit about it, but the whole science has been erased by the descendants of the Cabal, Freemasons, Illuminati. They don't want you to know about this. But there's mounds all over America, specifically in Ohio, Wisconsin, West Virginia are some of the biggest places, on through Pennsylvania, even New York in some places, the New York State. So here we got November 20th, 1883. And in this case, they unearthed a 7-foot skeleton in a 50-foot mound. And May 5th, 1885, as you see right here, a small mound. Oh, yeah, that was me working too fast. A small mound in Ohio with 4 huge skeletons, 7 to 8 feet tall, inside the mound, along with a whole bunch of cool things that it had included. So these giants, when they died, they'd bury themselves in these mounds. And we're now finding all these giant skeletons, and this is published in mainstream news. February 9th, 1890. Here again, this is in Pleasantville, New Jersey now. And what we see here is that they had a large mound with 8 bodies, 7 to 8 feet in height, and over 50 bodies in the mound altogether. You're probably starting to ask yourself, where the heck did all these skeletons go? Well, the Cabal created this thing called the Smithsonian Institution. And they say, oh, bring everything to the Smithsonian. We'll take care of it. It was the best false flag ever. Because the Smithsonian got all of those things, and now it is illegal to own or to publicly display any giant skeletons because it's considered desecrating Native American ruins. So there's a law on the books that makes it illegal for you to ever have any of these on display. So I hope you can see that what we're dealing with here is a very fascinating investigation that is far-reaching in scope, that has huge implications for what's going on in today's world. And all of the things that I'm telling you are part of this long-term battle for the future of the human civilization. What are we going to do on Earth? Where are we going? This geometric energy that we're made from has been around the whole time, and there's lots and lots of different people out there in the cosmos. We are made to ascend. The Illuminati cabal claims to be the descendants of these giants that were extraterrestrials, and I've now charted out the whole history that's never before been presented to the public. What you have just seen here is the very first time that anybody outside of a small circle of elite has ever gotten to hear and see the information that I have just presented to you. Yes, indeed. Where do I think all this is going? I think that we are on the threshold of a supernatural change in human evolution, and I'm going to be doing more of this kind of work as time goes on. You can read my books, Source Field Investigations and Synchronicity Key. Check out my show on Gaiam TV, Wisdom Teachings. It's a half an hour a week. And tonight, actually, believe it or not, is the night that the 100th episode aired of my show. 100 half hours. So, none of this stuff that I just showed you is on Gaiam TV. And it's getting harder and harder to outdo myself now, because so many of the conferences that people used to pay $300 to see are all free on Gaiam TV now. At least the 10-day trial is free. Then it's $9.99 a month. So anyway, there's a lot more to discuss, and I've done so much work. You can read my articles. I've done arguably more free stuff than anybody else in my field. There's a whole book on my website called Financial Tyranny, read by 1.5 million people, that's free, totally exposes the Illuminati, all the stuff they're doing with the financial system, and the subject of the ascension is really big. I want to thank all of you for coming here. This has been totally awesome. I'm still alive. We made it. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for being here. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.